We've all heard the saying, a fish doesn't know when it's wet, right? And I'm sorry for starting with such a stale platitude, but it describes my experience of being a Canadian Catholic so so very well, because we tend to get acclimatized to our situation and then we think, well, it's normal, this is just how things are. But there's a serious danger in thinking that way, because when you say something is normal, you're giving it permission to exist without asking whether it should or not. And when that kind of complacency takes root in us, sometimes drastic measures are necessary to uproot us from that attitude. Prophets are one kind of measure that have been used to do this kind of thing, because a prophet is someone who thinks differently from their surroundings and usually tries to stir everyone up to pay attention to some liability, usually moral or spiritual, that they haven't been attentive to. And the longer the people aren't attentive to it, the greater that liability becomes. So the prophet will be someone who is a contrarian, who is in the habit of telling people difficult truths that they often don't really want to hear. It's why prophets are so often persecuted within their home region. And we see this obviously throughout scripture, as well as in church history, with saints who defied the stream of complacency they found themselves in. Another measure is to simply take the fish out of the water so that he discovers the difference from where he was and where he could be. And in my case, I've had exposure to both, hearing from prophets and having the opportunity to be removed from my local context to see what Catholicism looks like outside of not just my archdiocese, but also my country. One of the effects of the spiritual malady that the church in Canada is suffering from is an over-reliance on foreign priests. But that's also given me the opportunity to hear a perspective of Catholicism that might be able to diagnose things that we as Canadians can't really see that easily for ourselves, which is why I'm always eager to ask foreign priests what they think of the church in Canada. And I'd also encourage other people, if you have a foreign priest who is your pastor, to take that opportunity to see what his perspective is like, given where he comes from and where he finds himself now. And when I asked one priest in particular, let's just say he didn't hold back. He just point blank said to me, he thinks this place is a spiritual wasteland. And while he was speaking directly about my local archdiocese, I think he was also addressing problems that exist throughout Canada as a whole. And a telling example of this is in the fact that every time the church comes under some sort of opposition from secular authorities or the media, our leaders immediately and unreservedly bow to their demands. We saw this in dramatic fashion with the Truth and Reconciliation scandal quite recently, and I've spoken about it at length on my channel, so I'm not going to go into details here again, but suffice it to say that false accusations were made against the church and her history, and instead of correcting the record, our bishops endorsed those accusations, pledged millions of dollars of lay tithes to be handed over to our accusers, and then got nothing in return for it. And in fact, I've got a book here, which if you want to learn more about it, it's called Grave Error. I'm pretty sure you can find it on Amazon. It's published by True North. Give that a read. I'm pretty sure that most of our bishops have not read it. There was no acceptance of apologies, no reconciliation, no restoration of the church's good name, just an endorsement of the worst possible interpretation of that history on our part, as we cower and hide in the hopes that the storm will just blow over. But of course, it never does, and the church finds itself further discredited and diminished every time. Another example that stood out to me recently was when I came across a Twitter account that posts images of what appears to be typical vintage Presbyterian churches. The person who hosts the account is a Presbyterian themselves, and as they go and visit these churches, they take pictures and they just post them. And most of what he posts there, if they were Catholic churches in my archdiocese, they would rank among the most beautiful church buildings around without question. And let's keep in mind that Presbyterians aren't really known for their highly stimulating art and culture. But the church here where I live is so hostile towards her own rich heritage and tradition, what Pope Benedict called a pathological self-hatred, that when we do a building project, we hire secular architects who know and care little about that tradition, or we deliberately seek to create something that is contrary to that tradition, just to signal to the outside world how relevant we are. At our theological college, which is the one that trains seminarians and future priests, we currently have a female Protestant president who admittedly was hired as an interim president, which, okay, maybe that was done out of necessity. But then you learn that she's also the chair of the committee to hire a permanent replacement, a committee which then sourced an outside recruiter who specializes in diversity, equity, and inclusion-based hiring practices. They also currently have a Lutheran deaconess teaching the literature class for seminarians. And in her role as a deaconess, she was also the chaplain at a Lutheran conference that made multiple pro-LGBT resolutions for their church. And again, this is where our future priests are getting their spiritual and intellectual training. And this goes on because not everybody is shocked by it. I think it's obviously shocking, and I expect that many of the people who watch my videos would find it shocking. But somehow we are so complacent about the state and the condition of our church that most people are just giving these kinds of things a pass. So while it's hard to hear a foreign priest say harsh things about my home diocese, I have to admit, I think he's got a point. And it's a point that has been reinforced for me by having the privilege of traveling to other cities and being exposed to the church outside of my own diocese. For example, in November, I was able to go to Colorado Springs speaking at a men's conference. And the person who was assigned to me to shuttle me from the airport, shout out to Kevin, if you're watching, by the way, he invited me to attend Sunday Mass at his parish after the conference with him and his wife, which I was happy to accept. And I really embraced the opportunity to play the tourist. And my impression of this parish was that it was a typical parish in their diocese with respect to their liturgical and theological sensibilities. It was a modern building. It had a choir that tried to combine contemporary and traditional styles. So it seemed to me to be a solid depiction of what a typical Catholic Mass in that diocese would look like. And if that parish were in my archdiocese, it would have been by far the standard to beat. It would have been the best music, the best performed liturgy, and among the better preaching you could find. And keep in mind, their diocese is composed of like 170-some thousand Catholics, whereas mine has more than double that. And that's not isolated. Virtually everywhere I go in the States, the church seems to be much healthier, much more alive than my home diocese, and what I can reasonably assume is indicative of the state of the church in Canada as a whole. Because the Catholic Church in Canada is seemingly captured by a spirit of banality and indifference, and it's a serious malaise that prevents us from fixing our institutions, reforming our terrible liturgy, and turning our attention to the actual mission of spreading the faith. And it's a big part of the reason why my family finds refuge in the traditional Latin Mass. It isn't because we are Latin Mass rigorists. We often go to the Novus Ordo for weekday Masses. It isn't because we reject Vatican II or the authority of the Pope or any of the kinds of things that traditional Catholics are often accused of. It's because in the time and the place we find ourselves in, the tradition of our faith is so thoroughly neglected, if not held in contempt, that we have to take radical measures to try to compensate for how poorly the faith is proposed, especially if we want to have any hope of our kids growing up with an intact faith. So I share that context for a few reasons. One is because the more familiar I am to certain audiences, I've noticed the more I'm perceived and even described as a traditionalist, which some people obviously don't like. But I can honestly say that if the kind of Novus Ordo that seems to be much more available in the United States were available here, it's possible that my family and I might not have ever gone searching for relief in the Latin Mass. And I share that because I want people to understand that my position on things is often a response to the extreme reality that I find myself in as a Catholic in the Latin Rite in general, but especially in the Church in Canada. So what might appear to some people to be excessive concern for liturgy and a recovery of traditional Catholicism is actually just a necessary reaction to how bad things can get in the church. And that might lead some people to treat my commentaries with a grain of salt. And to be honest, I kind of welcome that. If your local church is doing a great job of adhering to and protecting the apostolic faith, then praise God for that. If my criticizing failures to do so doesn't seem consistent with your experience, then it probably doesn't apply to your context. But it also might lead some people to say that my perspective is so distorted by my local context that it shouldn't have much bearing on the broader church. And I think that would be a mistake, because if nothing else, we need to see areas of need as a warning. In the same way that it's important to know about places where the church is under persecution and why we should be vigilant about that kind of thing, in the same way, we also should be aware of the risk of the church becoming unfaithful and complacent in her mission. I think there's a huge advantage in hearing from people with the kind of experience that I have, because it shows you what can easily happen in the church if we are negligent, if we grow lax in the things that we shouldn't be. And that's why I cautiously and maybe even reluctantly accept being categorized as a traditional Catholic. But not because tradition is all you need to know about Catholicism, but because the leadership and institutions of the Roman Church, especially where I live, have failed in the responsibility to uphold and promote tradition to the point of it becoming a serious crisis. And in different eras of the church's history, there have been saints and leaders who have called attention to the wounds or gaps in the body that are in desperate need of attention. For example, in the 12th and 13th centuries, the church had grown decadent and corrupt by its access to power in many of its organs. And it took the mendicant orders like the Franciscans and the Dominicans to call attention to the Christian vocation of solidarity with the poor through voluntary poverty to correct where the church had been negligent. Our problem today, however, is that we've gone chasing after every wind of doctrine in the secular sphere and abandoned our own tradition. And because it's such an essential part of the faith, we find ourselves on life support. And here's the thing, when you find yourself in a crisis, extreme and even immoderate measures are often the only antidote. For example, if you've become addicted to alcohol, you have to often implement a personal strategy of avoiding alcohol to the degree that a normal person just wouldn't. Like for me, I can casually have a drink of beer with my friends, and it's not going to cause me a problem. If I suddenly became a teetotaler for no reason, that would suggest that my concerns about alcohol have become excessive and irrational. But those measures are entirely appropriate if I find myself addicted to alcohol. In the same way, the church has dramatically neglected or even abandoned its own tradition to the degree that an excessive response to reclaim it and correct this era of experimentation isn't unreasonable. And in places where it's taken on extreme forms of infidelity, like where I live, this is especially so. I think it makes sense to focus an inordinate amount of attention on tradition and maybe even to embrace the traditionalist movement to a certain degree, because that's where the lost emphasis needs to be recovered. And by traditionalist movement, I mean the things that are good within the traditionalist movement. I don't mean embracing things that are schismatic or lead people to apostasy or heresy. I mean the things within the traditionalist movement that have been a part of the church throughout every generation of every century. Now, with all of that said, I mentioned a few weeks back that I was expanding my efforts with this channel, and I'm going to repeat that today. My goal is to publish at least twice as often and with more varied content, but in order to make that possible, I've had to take on new expenses with personnel and eventually what I hope will be a new studio space. Because it may surprise you to find out that I shoot these videos in my home. This is my basement office where I do most of my work, but the other shot you'll see sometimes is actually in my bedroom. And to be honest, my 3-bedroom house is proving to be too small for our family of 10, with me using space up for video production. So I really need to find studio space where I can continue this work. So if you appreciate the perspective that I share on matters of the faith, as well as culture and philosophy and even politics sometimes, please consider supporting the channel by either joining my locals community, where you can find opportunities to interact with me and other members of the community, which you can find at brianholdsworth.locals.com, or by contributing through my website by just visiting brianholdsworth.ca/help. And for what it's worth, I'm super excited to take this next step, and I'm very honored by the support I've been shown, even just by those of you who tune in to watch, let alone those who have pledged their support so far. It's incredibly humbling, and by God's grace, I will be able to continue this work with your help. So thank you in advance, and may God bless you for your generosity.